Hello everybody. We are ready for section 2.4b. We're going to have equations with fractions. There's going to be variables on both sides, just like in 2.4a. So we need to talk about a couple of things. There are two types of fraction problems, and there's kind of three approaches we can take with these. So I'm going to put these up, and then over on the side I'm going to put three different things. So first of all, notice this example, this first example, 1/2 x minus 7 equals x plus 2. We can have an equation that has a fraction as a coefficient, like a 1/2 in front of the x. Remember, the coefficient is always the term out in front of the variable. We all know on the right-hand side of the equation, the coefficient of that x is a 1. So we can just solve as usual. There's one option for solving this. We can go ahead and subtract x from both sides, add 7 to both sides. We've got a fraction, not a big deal. Another thing that we could do with a problem like this 1/2 x minus 7 equals x plus 2 is we could multiply by a least common denominator. Everybody remember least common denominator? The smallest number that goes into, or that is a factor of all of the denominators. Well, we only have one denominator, which is 2. So our LCD would be equal to 2. If we're going to multiply by a least common denominator, make yourself a little note. You're probably going to need to use the distributive property. So if I'm going to multiply by a least common denominator, I'm going to multiply by 2 on the left. I'm going to multiply by 2 on the right. It doesn't do a lot for the plain old numbers, but when we do 2 times 1/2 x, we end up with 2 over 2, or 1x, minus 14 equals 2x plus 4. So if you don't want to solve as usual and just subtract x and have a negative 1/2 x, you could always multiply by the least common denominator. Just remember the distributive property. Our third option has to do with a problem that looks a little bit different. And that's when we've got terms within a fraction. When I say that, look at that example. I'm talking about we've got a 2x minus 5 as the numerator of the first fraction. We've got an x as the numerator of the second fraction. So our third option when we've got fraction problems is to cross multiply. Cross multiply. The only thing that I want to make a little note of here is to put parentheses around, I'll put around parts. I don't know another way to say it. For example, that first denominator, I'm going to put parentheses around that because when I cross multiply, I'm going to need to use, I sound like a broken record, the distributive property. So I would do 3 times 2x minus 5, put an equal in the middle, 4 times x. Again, you can parenthesis that x if you want to, or you can just leave it. We know we're going to multiply it. And then we would solve it just like we did in section 2.4a. So you've really got 3 options. Just do it the regular way if you've got a problem like the first example. Multiply by the least common denominator, or cross multiply. When you cross multiply, you do need fractions though. Fraction equals a fraction typically. So if you need to make yourself a note there. All right, so let's talk about this first problem. This one actually looks a lot like our last practice problem because first thing I see is I see that 1/7, but I also see parentheses for distributive property. This may take care of itself. So let's go ahead and distribute first, see what we can do. So I've got an 8r minus 32. If I distribute over here, even though 1/7 times 49r is a little ugly, if you figure it out on your calculator or you know your times tables, that's just going to be a 7r plus 10. That worked itself out really nicely, right? So we don't really have to worry too much about fractions. We're just solving as usual. They just kind of took care of themselves. So if I want to get this 7r out of here, I'm going to subtract 7r. And I'm going to have a 1r minus 32 equals 10. Oh, this one's a nice one. When I go ahead and add 32 to get this guy out of here, I'm going to have an r equals 42. No last step of dividing needed. So let's look at the next example. I've got a 1/4 with a 7 plus 3g in parentheses. I've got a negative g over 8. So let's do a least common denominator. My denominators are 4 and 8. Well, if I've got a 4 and an 8, the smallest number that 4 and 8 both go into is 8. Because if I times by 8 and times by 8, those guys will cross out. These guys, 4 goes into 4 once, 4 goes into 8 twice. So it works out okay. So here's the thing. If I times by 8 and times by 8, this is one math problem I'm going to do. I'm not going to, and then I'll distribute that answer. So 8 times 1/4 is like 8 over 4, which is the same as 2. 7 plus 3g. Now remember, if you don't like this least common denominator, you could just solve as usual, distribute that 1/4. You've got fractions. If you start with fractions in your problem, keep fractions as your answer. Don't go to decimals. And then I'm going to put this, oh, nope, I'm not going to do that because I forgot I was multiplying by 8. This and this cross out just like the old-fashioned way. I'm left with the g, and don't forget that negative sign. And now I can finish solving this. So 2 times 7 is 14. 2 times 3g is a plus 6g equals negative g. Now I'm going to do this the way we've been doing it. I'm going to get all my variables on the left, all my numbers on the right. You may notice a shorter way to do this. If you do, go ahead and do so. I'm going to put my line here. So if I want to get this negative g out of here, I'm going to plus g. The reason I want to do it this way is because I want to mention this. If my negative g and plus g cross out, I have to put something on this other side of the equation, so I'm going to put a 0 there. If you notice that you could have just subtracted 6g, awesome, do that. Now I want to get this 14 to the other side, so that means I'm going to have a 7g equals negative 14, and everybody knows to divide by 7 for my last step. And g should be equal, don't forget, your negative 2. So I solved using the least common denominator. You could have had, back in this original problem, a 7/4 g plus, or sorry, 7/4 plus 3/4 g, and then you could have done some work from there. But sometimes least common denominator is really the only way to do that. And last but not least, let's do a problem like number 3. I've got an x plus 3 over 7 equals 2x. Well, this one I want to do that third possible way, which is cross multiply. However, I mentioned when you cross multiply, you've got to have a fraction equals a fraction. Could I make this 2x into a fraction? X plus 3 over 7. What could I put underneath the 2x that keeps it the same? Right, a 1. So I could make that into a fraction. I'm going to put parentheses around my parts so I don't forget when I've got more than one term. And now I'm going to cross multiply. It doesn't matter which way you go first. 7 times 2x. And now I'm going to solve this the old-fashioned way. So I've got 1x plus 3 when I distribute. I've got 14x over here. I'm going to have a really ugly answer, but that's all right. I started with fractions in my problem, so I'm going to have fractions in my answer. I'll do the same thing. I'm going to subtract, whoops, you can't see that. I'm going to subtract my 14x, get that out of there. And again, when I do that, I've got negative 13x plus 3. What does that have to be equal to? Well, 14x minus 14x We still have to have something in the equation. Sometimes people lose the equal sign and lose that 0. So now I'm going to get this 3 out of here by subtracting. So negative 13x equals negative 3. If you're a good equation solver and you did this a different way, hopefully you're still going to get a positive 3 over 13. Notice negative 3 over negative 13. Negatives cancel out. I'm not going to a decimal here. I'm keeping it as a fraction because my problem started as a fraction. All right. So there's one example of each one of those. I've got another problem in here. If you want to give that a shout, maybe we'll try that in class. But here's what I've got for lesson summary. What are the 3 ways that you can solve an equation that has fractions? And here's a little problem for you. That's got coefficients, a 3/4 x and a negative 1/4 x. So remember, you could either solve as usual or you could use a least common denominator for a 4 and a 4. It might be shouting at you if you want to try it that way. You should, however, get a whole number and integer answer. You won't get any kind of fraction for your answer for this one. That's it for section 2-4B. Have a fabulous day.